This is a brief review of action research. As you can see, action research is known by a lot of different names. Sometimes it's called teacher research, classroom research, practitioner inquiry, action learning, emancipatory research, but all of them have basically the same definition. So when you look at yourself as an educator, you are a teacher researcher. Every day you are observing children, assessing their feedback, evaluating their performance, adjusting your practice, and reflecting on your teaching to help your students achieve learning goals. That is a teacher researcher. You're paying attention to what's happening in your environment and how it impacts learning. So the big difference between your daily work as a teacher research and conducting action research is the systematic methods that you'll use to collect, analyze, and report your data and conclusion. So you're already doing this. What we're adding to it is the systematic part of it. So, definition of action research, and like I said, all of those different terms would go in there too, is the systematic and intentional inquiry carried out by teachers. So that means that it is planned and designed ahead of time with deliberate procedures to improve teaching and learning. In other words, you're going to take action, and it's done in the classroom, school, or community. So when you look at this definition, again, a lot of these things you are doing already. It's the deliberation or the intentionality of it that makes the difference. So just a little bit of history. Dewey is one of the first person that really talked about teachers doing their own research. A lot of times we think about research can only come out of colleges and universities, and it's the professors that are coming into classrooms and recording and analyzing and writing up papers. But really, it is teachers who make the biggest impact in the classroom, and so they're the ones that should be doing research on their own practice. So there's a couple of foundational works that really have led us to where we are right now with action research. One of them is Reclaiming the Classroom: Teacher Research as an Agency for Change. And this was in the mid to late 80s that action research really became recognized as a genre of research in and of itself. And that's when we started seeing more books about action research and practitioner journals about action research. And in the beginning, there was some resistance into actually classifying it as research. But as we go through the process, you're going to see that action research is just as rigorous as some of the other research that you might see in, say, the Reading Teacher or the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy, which again are the ones I know best because I am a literacy person. And then one of the other ones is, for those of you who are middle or high school English teachers, you might recognize in the middle, which is a writer's workshop book by Nancy Atwell. And that really was an action research project where she was observing her own teaching and how it impacted her student learning. So the goals of action research is clearly to enhance the learning experiences of children. And how you do this through action research is that it helps you make more informed choices about the pedagogy programs and content that you use with children. Or if you don't have a choice on those things, it might help you refine your uses of pedagogy programs and content. In addition, it enhances your teaching experience because it is professional learning. It helps you reflect on your practice. In most cases, people do action research in collaboration with colleagues because it's always helpful to have a critical friend that you can bounce ideas off of, which obviously leads to an improvement in teaching and learning, which provides more satisfaction in your job if you're not frustrated with it. It's much more relevant than some other professional development that is sometimes offered to educators because you are choosing the topics you want to study and how you're going to study it. So it's very applicable to what's going on in your classroom right now. And again, it helps you develop more of your own professional work in the classroom and recognizing that as a teacher, you are a researcher, and just like those professors in colleges and universities, you too can produce a research report of high quality based on the work that you do in your classroom. So the general process of action research is, I put it in a circle because it is both linear, that there are some things you need to do first, but it keeps going back and forth. And that's the great thing about action research. A lot of time when we think about research in the hard sciences, and I know I've taught science, and if you've used the FOSS kit, we talk about the research process, and it's very linear, where you ask a question, you develop your experiments, you do your observation, you write report. Action research does use those same types of steps, except it recognizes that as you start working in your research context, you might find out that what you thought was going to be a great thing ends up not working, and it would be unethical to continue to do that thing if it's not working for the students. And so you might have to stop what you're doing, go back and rethink it, and that's okay. So when you think about action research, it generally starts with identifying an inquiry or a question. So what is something you're wondering about? And we're going to talk more about that question later. But it starts with a wondering. I want to know if using audiobooks is going to increase reading enjoyment for my non-readers, or if I incorporate graphic novels in my Shakespearean unit, will I have more students read the book or read the play? So you start with a question or inquiry. You develop a plan. How would I know if what I'm looking for is happening? So think through systematically. Well, if here's my question, I need to collect data on this, this, and this. This is how I'm going to do it, and here's my timeline. So you develop your plan, and you start collecting your data and information. As you're doing that, you're going to, at the same time, analyze and interpret your data, because again, if you decide to try something and it's not working, you want to stop it. But if you try something and it's working really well, you might say, hey, there's these other pieces of data I could collect. And so as you're analyzing, as you're gathering, you're going to start making some interpretations and thinking about what you might want to do next. So as you can see, it's kind of a process that goes back and forth on each other. Then reflect on what you're learning. And so if you're seeing that graphic novels is increasing the rate of participation for students in reading the Shakespearean play that you're doing, because there's a lot of really great graphic novels for that, you might say, hey, maybe I need to buy some more. So you're going to take some action based on what you're learning. And if you're seeing that audiobooks are increasing your non-readers' ability to access texts, which sounds kind of obvious, but a lot of people don't think that reading through audiobooks is real reading. But if they're participating more in class activities because they have something, or they feel like they have something to contribute because they can listen to the book that the rest of their classmates are physically reading with their eyes, you might buy a few more and see if it makes a difference. Or if it's not working, you might want to try something else. And so you're going to reflect and take action and continue to look on that. But then you also want to share. And part of the reason we do this is because what you learn in your classroom is a small part of a much broader context. So there's a really good chance if you tried something and it worked really well for you, it might work for another teacher in Connecticut. And the only way they're going to know about that is if you share it in some way, shape, or form. This might be through a presentation. It could be through something locally. So maybe there's another teacher in another school that could really use your support and your ideas. It might be at a conference, Kansas Association for Teachers of English, or the mathematics one. You might do something locally. You could do something nationally as a presentation. But there's also a lot of journals that specifically look for action research. And there's also other journals, depending what your topic is, you might look for the subject area journal. So you want to share your information because what's happening in your classroom matters. What you learn about what works matters, because it adds to the understanding of classrooms for all of us. So don't hesitate to do that. And then generally, people who engage in action research, usually one study leads into another one. And again, when we talk about research here, we're not talking about like a big R research where you need to write for funding and get thousands of dollars and have participation rates of 100 children. Action research is specifically for classroom and classroom teachers or educators to be looking at a small slice of something that will then lead to another question. So you don't have to think about your study has to be this huge thing that's going to be greatly impactful. You're going to look at it as small steps. So, as I said, it often begins with wondering. And action research is really broad, which is another great thing about action research. It could start with a wondering about a particular child. How can I help this student? Or maybe a group, if you have an MTSS group that no matter what you try, they just seem to keep struggling, that might be your wondering. It might come out of your curriculum that you want to improve or enrich something you're already doing. It might be about developing your own content knowledge. My cousin is a third and fourth grade teacher back in Wisconsin, and she has gotten involved in historical reenactments, and she's looking at how her participation in the summer in these reenactments, and she goes to Williamsburg and learns about the actual history of the area, and she's worked with blacksmiths, and she's worked with the cooking equipment of the time, and she has created this character that when she gets to the unit, she becomes this character for her students. And so she's looking at how that's impacting the way that she's teaching her history units for her third and fourth graders and their understanding of and connection to the history. So she's developing her content knowledge by attending these summer workshops, but it's impacting the way she's teaching. You might want to try something completely new. You might hear about, and I'll get on my soapbox, Flipgrid, and say, hey, I want to try Flipgrid to have students present book talks, and so that they can hear each other's recommendations. You might explore your relationship between your beliefs and your classroom practice. I worked with two third grade teachers when they were implementing a reading and writing workshop, and they were really struggling with it because they came from a school situation where it was a very scripted and direct curriculum that every kid was doing pretty much the same thing in the same way at the same time. And reader writer workshop doesn't work that way. And so they struggled in the beginning to try to reconcile those two things. Like, how do I know that students are learning when they're not all doing the same thing? You also might look at the intersection of your personal and professional identities. So, how could things that you do in your everyday life impact what you do in the classroom? So, for example, I have a really good friend who is a science teacher, and one of her passions is marine biology and environmental issues. And so, a lot of her work, she tries to incorporate those things, and she wonders sometimes, am I pushing my beliefs on my students, or is this really helping them connect more to environmental issues? You might be looking at some way that you might affect change or advocate for social justice. And so you might look at something like, what if I intentionally choose diverse books to highlight in my classroom? Will my children gravitate toward those? And will they start seeing themselves in the books that we're reading? Or you might focus on something specifically in your teaching and learning context. So I know right now MTSS is a major issue here, and so you might look at how you are involved in that process and how it is working or not working for you and your students. So there's a really broad range of things that you could be thinking about, but again, it doesn't have to be a huge project. It can be an individual child, it can be an individual technique or strategy, and that'll lead to your next question. So if you do have a broad question, break it down into small steps and start with the first step as your first wondering. So quite often we have teachers collaborate with each other in action research, because research is hard work. So I did say in the beginning that you are a teacher researcher already. You're doing many of these things every day, but we're always so rushed in schools. And it's really nice having somebody to bounce ideas off of, because teacher talk is really important. Through dialogue, as you are articulating to somebody else, you're practicing and clarifying and articulating your thinking, which helps you become more clear because you have to explain it to another person. And then, right now we are doing this within the school district, and so we have a group that can provide support when you get stuck on something, or how do I think about this, or I'm not quite sure how to collect this data. You've got a support system that you can draw from. And honestly, communities of teacher researchers change schools because when teachers are advocating for themselves and for their students because of the research they've done in their classroom of what is impacting learning, it really makes a difference in the culture of the school. So there's a couple of different types of collaboration. Shared inquiry is when two teachers share the same question and they develop and use the same plan within their own context. So I had mentioned that I had worked with two third-grade teachers. They were implementing reading and writing workshop for the first time. They had a lot of the same questions, and so even though there were two separate classrooms, they were asking the same questions. And so when we came together, they were constantly talking about the same types of things. A parallel inquiry is when two teachers are conducting two different projects, but they work collaboratively to support each other's individual work. And so you might have your own question, your partner might have a completely different question, but you make the time for each other to talk through what your plans are, what your data collection is. And so you can, again, bounce ideas off of each other and practice how to talk about these things so it clarifies it for itself. You might also have potentially an intersecting inquiry where two teachers or two or more are conducting similar questions. So take, for example, graphic novels. The types of questions you might ask about graphic novels at the middle or high school level would be really different than what you would be asking at a second or third grade level. But you might have two people really interested in using graphic novels in the classroom. And so you could share a lot of resources for your lit review and things like that, but the questions you're going to ask might be a little bit different. So, as we start moving into what your question would be, you also need to think about what's going to make it researchable, which I know is not a real word, but I'm going to use it anyway. So something that's researchable is something that's within your control. If you can't change it, don't try to research it because it's just going to frustrate you. In action research, we're talking about teaching or learning, so it's either something that you do or what you ask your students to do, that you are interested in it because you're going to spend some time with it, and that we'll take the Goldilocks principle, that it's just right, that it's not too big, but at the same time, it's not too narrow. So you'll be able to collect enough data to give you some good information, but not too much where you'd be overwhelmed. Also, try not to do something that is just, is this better than this? Because a lot of times when we ask which of these two things are better, we tend to ignore the how and the why of something. Let me give you an example. So one of the action researches that I'm doing is the use of traditional discussion boards and Flipgrid. Both of them at their core do the same thing. They're both ways that students can respond to something. One of them is done in text and one of them is done through video response. Now, if I just ask the question, which one is better, I'm not going to look at the details of which one works best for a particular thing. And one of the things that I'm finding is with the video responses, students are much more able to show things in the video. And so I can ask them to show a process, like what is your reading process? And they can do a triptych and actually show us in the video, which is a lot harder to do in text because it takes more to write about it. But at the same time, I'm seeing that in the traditional discussion boards, students are more likely to disagree with each other and use multiple examples of other resources because it's text. They can copy and paste in quotes and things like that. So by just asking which one's better, I would lose the nuances of those things. And so I am learning in this particular study is that both of them are good for particular things. And as an instructor, I need to be intentional about which one I use and for what purpose. That's a much more complex question. And then make sure that you're able to collect multiple pieces of data about a topic. So just a pre and post test is probably not going to be enough because most students will improve with any type of instruction. So make sure you can collect multiple pieces of data about whatever topic it is. So let me give you an example of how you can start narrowing things down. So we start out with a big topic, and most people are able to figure out a topic. So what's the thing? Then what's the problem? Now, quite often we really focus on what's not going well in our classrooms. Flip that for the purpose. So the purpose of my study is to understand such and such, and then you have a question. So these are the really broad ways of thinking about it. What's your topic? What's your problem? What's your purpose of your study, which leads to a question. So let me give you an example. So if my topic is motivation, and my problem is my English language learners aren't participating in math discussion. So that's my problem. My ELL students are not participating in math discussions. So what do I want to do? I want to find ways to support my English language learners in talking about math. So how does this connect motivation? Well, if I think at first that it is all about motivation, that they're just not motivated to participate, I might miss some of the other things that I need to do. So my question might end up being, how can I better support my English language learners in whole group discussions in math class? So I've got a couple of really specific things I'm looking at. I'm only looking at my English language learners, and specifically in whole group discussions, and specifically in math class. So that's going to help me narrow things down a little bit. And I might find out that it might not be all about motivation. It might be more about self-concept, that they're, or learner identity, that they're afraid to look foolish in front of others. So it gives me some more possibilities. So the next thing you want to start thinking about is data. And there's basically three forms of data that we can consider when we're doing research. One of them is observational data. So these are things like field notes, anecdotal records. So you had a conversation with a child and you might write something down, or you observe something. You might do a log, a diary, or journal. A lot of times I made notes in my lesson plan book that I could go back and look at. You might have a checklist. Are students doing these things, and you check it off. You could potentially video or audio record things that are happening in the classroom, take photos, behavior scales. All of those things are basically you're watching children and recording it in some way, shape, or form. Now, an inquiry form of data is when you're actually guiding the types of answers you're going to get. So this would be interviews and questionnaires and surveys, attitude scales, focus groups where you have a small group of students coming together and you're asking questions, or conferences you have with students, or if you have them do reflective journals or learning logs, those types of things, you're setting out specific questions for them to answer. Now that's different than data that you might get from documents. And so you might look at work samples, tests and quizzes, student self-assessments, their portfolios, standardized test scores, your own lesson plans, or peer reviews of each other. So these are just kind of three categories to be thinking about. And as I mentioned earlier is you want more than one form of data. Generally we talk about triangulation. And so at least three forms of data. But remember, as the researcher, you're also generating data as you're writing down field notes, as you're watching students, or you have your own research log where you might do something in a day and just sit down and reflect for 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the day. That is data too. So it doesn't necessarily all have to come from the subject of interest, in this case probably your students. It can also come from you as the instructor. Now we need to talk a little bit about rigor in action research. In hard sciences, which are usually quantitative and positivist, which means there's a right or wrong answer, we tend to talk a lot about validity and reliability. And so it basically is to the extent, it means to what extent does a study findings represent the phenomenon the researchers are claiming to measure? Could it be repeated? Is it generalizable? So in the hard sciences, they have the advantage of having laboratories and that they can control all of the variables down to like the smallest drop. In education, we can't do that. It would be unethical for us to control that much. And so in action research, and quite often in qualitative research, which is more the narrative research, we tend to use the terms rigor or trustworthiness, which means the strength of the inference made possible by the given research study. And so, especially in action research, could it be repeated? Potentially, If I'm studying the use of graphic novels in my classroom, any other teacher could do that same study. I could, list the titles that I bought and the procedures, the book talks I gave, that type of thing. Those types of things could be repeated. However, if I'm doing this in Manhattan, Kansas, and somebody else is doing this in Miami, Florida, the context is going to be completely different. We might have wildly different numbers of students in their classroom, support from our administration, access to technology. All of those types of things can't be necessarily controlled for. And so even if it's repeated, it might get completely different results based on the context. So when we're talking about rigor or trustworthiness in action research, a couple of the things that we need to think about as we're doing our plans is, first of all, having triangulation of data. And so having multiple sources of data, but also having a really clear and thorough description of the context. And again, because it's research, if you're going to share it, you're going to change names, but in general, is it urban, suburban, or rural school district? How many free and reduced kids are in the school and in my classroom? Who are the participants? What processes I used, etc. That when somebody is reading it, they could go, oh yeah, that's pretty similar to my situation, or that's wildly different. It's like a dream. They only have 15 students in their class. What kinds of things would I have to do differently for my 25? So that's the types of things is giving enough information that the reader could think about the transferability of it. And then clearly we need to adhere to ethical research. And so if you're involving students in your research, if you're taking data from them, to make sure that you go through the process of in your school district of getting permission to do research, and also informing your parents and your students about how you're going to do that. We'll talk more about that in the next session. So the next thing you're going to start thinking about is your literature review, or engaging with the literature. And right now, as you're still kind of exploring what your question is, what your data sources might be, this is kind of a play around in the sandbox type thing. So think about what your main topics are, what your keywords are, and start going through Google Scholar and thinking about what are some of the studies that have already been done about the topic in the context of what you're looking at. So again, if am I looking at graphic novels, I would look at what other teachers have done, what other researchers have done in graphic novels. At first I might look at all grade levels and then start narrowing it down to what grade level I'm particularly in. If I'm looking at Reader Writer Workshop, I use those as my keywords and how it's been implemented in different schools and classrooms. Now, when we're talking about research, and this is again just the step above of what we do every day in the classroom, we want to be thoughtful about the quality of our sources. And so basically the gold standard is the peer-reviewed studies. And that means that when people submit to the journal, the article is sent out to 2 or 3 people in the field. They may be educators, they may be professors, but people who know the area, who read through the study and look for the rigor, the trustworthiness, the process, that type of thing, and ask questions and gives feedback. And so peer-reviewed studies, they get submitted, they're reviewed by 2 or 3 people, feedback is given, revisions are made, and so the people in the field in general recognize that this is a worthwhile study. There's also meta-analysis. So these are papers that the author goes out and looks for all of the studies about such and such topic, and goes through to look at the commonalities between the studies and some of the differences. And they analyze all of these studies together to put together a conclusion. And this is part of the reason that I would encourage you to do action research, because when researchers go in and look at, say, use of Flipgrid, there might be one teacher that used it with 25 students for a poetry unit. That gives an important part of an overall understanding of using Flipgrid with students. So that's a meta-analysis. You can certainly use professional books from respective publishers, educational magazines like Instructor. There's lots of resources from the Department of Education, both at the local and the national level, and government publications. And then there's some really interesting information in news media that is kind of the opposite end of the peer-reviewed studies, but a lot of times the news media can really um, give an indication of something that's important. And so things like the New York Times educational supplement will usually have articles that really kind of show the trend in education. And it might be useful as one of many sources to use. Also think about the timeliness of resources. A lot of times things change very quickly, especially in technology. But you also might need to read a seminal study that's foundational. So if you're doing any work with, say, reading response theory, you would want to read Louise Rosenblatt, which originally wrote in the 30s, was republished in the 70s. It's older, but it's still very foundational. So this really depends on what your topic is. Some things might not have anything on them before 1990 potentially. Then when you're reading your literature, critically read it. So make sure you're questioning the author and the data, and even though they've been peer reviewed, don't take everything at face value. Really think about who wrote this for what reason. For example, there's a lot of research out there for Accelerated Reader, and a lot of the research is sponsored by various companies that have ties to Accelerated Reader. And so really look at who's writing and for what purpose to make sure that not only is it a well put together study, but it's also a study that didn't start out with a whole lot of bias in the first place. Then start thinking about an organizational structure that's going to work for you in recording the literature that you are reading through, because eventually you're going to need to write a literature review, which is an actual narrative of your understanding of the literature. So as you are starting to go through articles, find something that works for you. I've tried a couple of different processes. Sometimes I've done a spreadsheet where I've had the title of the article, the author, the year that it was published, keywords that I pulled out of the article that were important to me and to my study, and then a short summary of it. I've also done basically that same thing, but I've printed the articles. I wrote the keywords up on the top when I got done reading it. I flipped it over, and on the back I wrote a summary. So you can do it old school, new school, whatever works for you. Some people like citation managers that are freely available. There's things like RefWorks and I just lost the word of the one that I use. But there's a couple of other ones out there. Oh, Mendeley is the one I use, where you can actually save the articles, do your highlighting, and it will also help you with your citations at the end. But think about it ahead of time so that, 3-6 months down the road, you're not going, oh man, I wish I would have done this. So how are you going to organize the literature you're reading? How are you going to take notes and be able to access it later? Now, while you're doing this, you also need to be thinking about how you might take a process of self-reflection. So a lot of times we encourage researchers at all levels to have a research log or a notebook or a journal or field notes or whatever you want to call them. And it's just a systematic place to sit down and write your reflections on what's going on. And with action research, part of that is exploring what our thoughts and beliefs are on teaching and learning. And so you might just do a couple of times, sit down for 5-10 minutes and do a free write. What do I believe about teaching and learning? What is a good student to me? What do I value in my classroom? Maybe go back to your undergrad papers that you might have saved on some hard drive someplace and look at what your original teaching philosophy was, and do you still agree with it? And if you had to write it now, would it be the same? So a couple of things to be looking at is that self-reflection, describing the situation that you're currently in, that you're doing this action research on, that you want to change. And then some explanations. What do you think might happen? So this might explore a little bit, do we have any biases going into it? And again, I'm talking about graphic novels. I personally have a bias going into it. I think it's a great thing. Same with audiobooks. I think readers need to be exposed to graphic novels and audiobooks. And so I'm going to be highly enthusiastic about it. I worked with a first grade teacher that was starting to use what she called alternative texts. She wouldn't classify them as nonfiction or fiction. They were, as she called it, the weird ones. And when she first went into it, she's like, well, these are just dumb books, and I don't know why students would want it. But when she started finding some of these alternative texts and things that, like Mo Williams and Geronimo Stilton, the books that have a combination of fonts and some pictures and not pictures. Bad Kitty's another one. That kind of the postmodern books that really make genre labels very difficult. She started to find that her students were really drawn to these types of things, and they had conversations about these books. And so going into it, she was not highly supportive of it, but as she saw her students engaging with these alternative texts, she realized that there was definitely a place for them in her classroom. So, think about what you think might be happening. See if you can explore any of those biases that you might have. So next time we'll get a little bit deeper into literature review and how you put that together. And we'll talk about some of the ethical implications of doing action research.